In a dusty Colorado town, where hope runs as thin as the mountain air, Eleanor Moore clutches her growing belly and watches the town council nail boards across her schoolhouse door. The young widow has fought for months to keep the one-room school alive, but without a husband to vouch for her, the town fathers have decided she's too fragile to teach their children. 23 students now face a future without education, and Ellie faces a future without purpose. Then Wyatt Callan rides into town, a weathered rancher whose reputation for keeping to himself is matched only by his reputation for getting what he wants. When he sees what's happening to the school that's changed his orphaned niece's life, he makes an offer that shocks everyone. He'll fund the entire operation himself. But why would a man who never learned to read risk everything for a pregnant teacher's dream? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months earlier, when the autumn leaves painted the Colorado mountainsides in shades of amber and rust, Eleanor Moore had stood in this same schoolhouse with very different feelings in her heart. The morning sun had streamed through windows. The Thomas had installed himself, casting golden rectangles across the wooden floors he'd sanded smooth with his own careful hands. Back then, the desks, 12 of them built from local pine, had been filled with eager faces, and the chalkboard bore the neat script of lessons planned together during long winter evenings. Eleanor ran her fingers along the worn leather binding of Thomas's teaching journal, the artifact that had become her most treasured possession since his passing. His careful handwriting filled every page, documenting not just lesson plans, but his hopes for each student. Little Mary Patterson struggles with her letters, he'd written in his precise script, but shows remarkable understanding of numbers. Perhaps mathematics will be her path to confidence. Below that, in Eleanor's more flowing hand, she'd added her own observations. Mary's shyness comes from fear of making mistakes. Extra encouragement needed. The journal represented everything they'd built together, not just a school, but a philosophy of education rooted in understanding each child's unique gifts. Thomas had believed that every student deserved individual attention, that learning should kindle curiosity rather than extinguish it through harsh discipline. It was a progressive approach that had sometimes raised eyebrows among the more traditional families, but the results spoke for themselves. Children who'd arrived barely able to write their names were soon composing simple stories. Students who'd never touched a book were reading aloud with confidence. Now, 5 months after a sudden fever had taken Thomas from her, Eleanor faced the enormous task of continuing their work alone. The pregnancy she'd discovered 2 weeks after his funeral felt like both a blessing and an impossible burden. How could she teach 23 children while carrying one of her own? How could she manage discipline when some of the older boys already tested boundaries they wouldn't have dared cross with Thomas present? The cottage behind the school, where she and Thomas had planned to raise their family, felt cavernously empty. His coffee cup still sat in the kitchen cupboard, though she'd stopped setting it out for breakfast months ago. His teaching clothes hung in the wardrobe, the sleeves still holding the shape of arms that would never again gesture enthusiastically while explaining the wonders of geography or the beauty of poetry. Eleanor's own wardrobe had grown tight around her expanding waist, forcing her to let out seams and add panels to her few good dresses. The physical changes reminded her daily of the life growing within her, but also of the whispered conversations that ceased whenever she entered the general store or the church social hall. A pregnant widow teaching their children. It challenged every notion of propriety the town held dear. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, had been particularly vocal in her concerns. "It simply isn't natural," she'd confided to anyone who would listen. A woman in her condition, managing all those children without a man's firm hand to maintain order. "Mark my words, something unfortunate will happen." Her predictions carried weight in a community where women's voices were often filtered through their husbands' opinions. But Eleanor had also found unexpected allies. Sarah Williams, whose 3 children attended the school, had quietly organized other mothers to help with maintenance tasks. They'd arrive on Saturday mornings with buckets and scrub brushes, cleaning windows and sweeping floors while their children played in the schoolyard. "You concentrate on the teaching," Sarah had said firmly. "We'll handle the rest." The children themselves seemed largely unaware of the adult concerns swirling around their education. They arrived each morning with the same enthusiasm Thomas had always inspired, eager to share discoveries and proud to display their improving penmanship. 8-year-old Sarah Callan, the quiet niece of the mysterious rancher, had blossomed under Eleanor's patient encouragement. The child who'd barely spoken above a whisper in September was now volunteering to read aloud and asking thoughtful questions about the stories they studied. It was Sarah Callan's transformation that had first caught Eleanor's attention as something remarkable. The girl had arrived at the school midway through the previous year, a thin, frightened child whose uncle had gruffly explained she needed book learning, but offered no other details. Eleanor had sensed trauma beneath the girl's silence, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the careful distance she maintained from adults, the fierce protectiveness she showed toward the few personal belongings in her small satchel. Gradually, through patient kindness and the magic of stories, Sarah had begun to emerge from her shell. She showed particular aptitude for writing, crafting simple tales about brave princesses and loyal horses that revealed an imagination far richer than her timid demeanor suggested. When she'd written her first complete story, 3 pages about a lost kitten finding its way home, Eleanor had felt the same joy Thomas always experienced when a student made a breakthrough. Now, standing in the boarded schoolhouse, Eleanor clutched the teaching journal closer to her chest. Thomas's dreams lived on in these pages, in the carefully documented progress of each student, in the educational philosophy they'd developed together through countless discussions and shared experiences. The town council could board up the building, but they couldn't seal away the knowledge that lived in these pages, or the conviction that every child deserved the chance to learn and grow. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her reverie, and Eleanor looked up to see a familiar figure dismounting from a dusty horse. Wyatt Callan pulled off his worn leather work gloves and slapped them against his thigh, sending up a small cloud of dust that caught the late afternoon light. These gloves, cracked and stained from years of honest labor, had become as much a part of him as his weathered hands beneath them. Every crease and callus told a story of fences mended, cattle branded, and countless dawn-to-dusk days spent building, something lasting from the unforgiving Colorado soil. The Rocking Sea Ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of prime grazing land, its boundaries marked by stone posts Wyatt had set himself over the course of 20 years. From his position on the ridge overlooking the main pasture, he could see his herd of Aberdeen Angus scattered like black dots against the golden grass, their sleek coats testament to careful breeding and constant attention. This land was his life's work, earned through backbreaking labor and shrewd business decisions that had slowly expanded his holdings from a modest homestead to one of the region's most prosperous operations. But prosperity hadn't brought him the peace he'd expected. At 34, Wyatt had built everything he'd dreamed of as a young man, fresh from the crowded tenements of Chicago. Yet something essential remained missing. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, preferring the honest company of livestock to the complicated social expectations of town life. Neighbors knew him as fair in his dealings, but distant in his manner, a man who paid his debts promptly and kept his own counsel. The townspeople respected him for his success and his reliability, but they also whispered about his past. Stories circulated about his reasons for leaving the city, though none came close to the truth. Some claimed he'd been involved in labor disputes. Others suggested a failed romance had driven him west. In reality, Wyatt had simply grown tired of being poor and powerless, watching his father work himself to death in a factory while the family struggled to afford basic necessities. The West offered opportunity to a man willing to work for it, and Wyatt had embraced that chance with everything he possessed. His inability to read beyond the most basic words remained his closely guarded secret. He'd left school at 10 to help, support his family, and pride had prevented him from seeking help once he'd achieved success. He'd developed elaborate workarounds, memorizing the appearance of important documents, relying on trusted associates to read contracts aloud, claiming his eyes troubled him when forced to examine written materials. Most business in cattle country was still conducted on handshakes and spoken agreements anyway, which suited his limitations perfectly. The arrangement had worked well enough until 18 months ago, when his brother James had died in a mining accident, leaving 8-year-old Sarah orphaned and traumatized. Wyatt had ridden to Denver immediately, finding his niece hollow-eyed and silent in the care of overwhelmed neighbors. The responsibility of raising a child terrified him more than any bronco he'd ever faced. But blood was blood, and Sarah was the only family he had left. Bringing her to the ranch had been like introducing a frightened sparrow to a world of hawks and eagles. Sarah barely spoke above a whisper, jumped at sudden movements, and spent most of her time hiding in the small room he'd prepared for her. Wyatt found himself completely unprepared for the needs of a grieving child. His attempts at conversation fell flat. His efforts to interest her in ranch activities met with polite but distant compliance. The breakthrough had come when Mrs. Williams from town had mentioned the new school term beginning. "That child needs the company of others her age," she'd said firmly. "Education will give her purpose and hope for the future." Wyatt had resisted. Initially, what use were books and arithmetic to a rancher's family? But Sarah's continued withdrawal worried him more than his own skepticism. The transformation that followed had been nothing short of miraculous. Within weeks of starting school, Sarah began speaking in complete sentences. She asked questions about everything from the stars overhead to the names of wildflowers in the pasture. Most remarkably, she'd started reading aloud in the evenings, sharing stories that transported Wyatt to places he'd never imagined. Through her innocent enthusiasm, he began to glimpse the worlds that literacy could unlock. When Sarah had proudly shown him her first written story, a simple tale about a brave calf who saved his herd from wolves, Wyatt had felt a pride deeper than any business success. The carefully formed letters, the imaginative plot, the confidence. In her voice, as she read it aloud, all spoke to possibilities he'd never considered. This was what education could do for a child, he realized. It could take a broken, frightened girl and help her find her voice again. Now, watching the sun set over his prosperous ranch, Wyatt understood that his niece's future depended on more than land and cattle. She needed the knowledge that books could provide, the confidence that came from learning, the opportunities that education would create. And if the town's prejudices threatened to steal that future from her, well, he'd built everything he owned. By refusing to accept other people's limitations, his work gloves had helped him build this ranch through determination and sweat. Now it was time to see what else they could accomplish. Wyatt Callan pulled off his worn leather work gloves and slapped them against his thigh, sending up a small cloud of dust that caught the late afternoon light. These gloves, cracked and stained from years of honest labor, had become as much a part of him as his weathered hands beneath them. Every crease and callus told a story of fences mended, cattle branded, and countless dawn-to-dusk days spent building something lasting from the unforgiving Colorado soil. The Rocking Sea Ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of prime grazing land. Its boundaries marked by stone posts, Wyatt had set himself over the course of 20 years. From his position on the ridge overlooking the main pasture, he could see his herd of Aberdeen Angus scattered like black dots against the golden grass, their sleek coats testament to careful breeding and constant attention. This land was his life's work, earned through backbreaking labor and shrewd business decisions that had slowly expanded his holdings from a modest homestead to one of the region's most prosperous operations. But prosperity hadn't brought him the peace he'd expected. At 34, Wyatt had built everything he'd dreamed of as a young man, fresh from the crowded tenements of Chicago, yet something essential remained missing. He'd grown comfortable with solitude, preferring the honest company of livestock to the complicated social expectations of town life. Neighbors knew him as fair in his dealings, but distant in his manner, a man who paid his debts promptly and kept his own counsel. The townspeople respected him for his success and his reliability, but they also whispered about his past. Stories circulated about his reasons for leaving the city, though none came close to the truth. Some claimed he'd been involved in labor disputes. Others suggested a failed romance had driven him west. In reality, Wyatt had simply grown tired of being poor and powerless, watching his father work himself to death in a factory while the family struggled to afford basic necessities. The West offered opportunity to a man willing to work for it, and Wyatt had embraced that chance with everything he possessed. His inability to read beyond the most basic words remained his closely guarded secret. He'd left school at 10 to help, support his family, and pride had prevented him from seeking help once he'd achieved success. He'd developed elaborate workarounds, memorizing the appearance of important documents, relying on trusted associates to read contracts aloud, claiming his eyes troubled him when forced to examine written materials. Most business in cattle country was still conducted on handshakes and spoken agreements anyway, which suited his limitations perfectly. The arrangement had worked well enough until 18 months ago, when his brother James had died in a mining accident, leaving 8-year-old Sarah orphaned and traumatized. Wyatt had ridden to Denver immediately, finding his niece hollow-eyed and silent in the care of overwhelmed neighbors. The responsibility of raising a child terrified him more than any bronco he'd ever faced. But blood was blood, and Sarah was the only family he had left. Bringing her to the ranch had been like introducing a frightened sparrow to a world of hawks and eagles. Sarah barely spoke above a whisper, jumped at sudden movements, and spent most of her time hiding in the small room he'd prepared for her. Wyatt found himself completely unprepared for the needs of a grieving child. His attempts at conversation fell flat. His efforts to interest her in ranch activities met with polite but distant compliance. The breakthrough had come when Mrs. Williams from town had mentioned the new school term beginning. "That child needs the company of others her age," she'd said firmly. "Education will give her purpose and hope for the future." Wyatt had resisted. Initially, what use were books and arithmetic to a rancher's family? But Sarah's continued withdrawal worried him more than his own skepticism. The transformation that followed had been nothing short of miraculous. Within weeks of starting school, Sarah began speaking in complete sentences. She asked questions about everything from the stars overhead to the names of wildflowers in the pasture. Most remarkably, she'd started reading aloud in the evenings, sharing stories that transported Wyatt to places he'd never imagined. Through her innocent enthusiasm, he began to glimpse the worlds that literacy could unlock. When Sarah had proudly shown him her first written story, a simple tale about a brave calf who saved his herd from wolves, Wyatt had felt a pride deeper than any business success. The carefully formed letters, the imaginative plot, the confidence. In her voice as she read it aloud, all spoke to possibilities he'd never considered. This was what education could do for a child, he realized. It could take a broken, frightened girl and help her find her voice again. Now, watching the sun set over his prosperous ranch, Wyatt understood that his niece's future depended on more than land and cattle. She needed the knowledge that books could provide, the confidence that came from learning, the opportunities that education would create. And if the town's prejudices threatened to steal that future from her, well, he'd built everything he owned by refusing to accept other people's limitations. His work gloves had helped him build this ranch through determination and sweat. Now it was time to see what else they could accomplish. The official school closure notice lay folded in Eleanor's trembling hands, its formal language as cold and final as a tombstone inscription. The document, bearing the official seal of Pine Ridge Township and signed by all 5 council members, represented everything she'd feared since Thomas's death: the systematic dismantling of their shared dream, reduced to bureaucratic efficiency and municipal cost-cutting. The town hall had been packed beyond capacity for the emergency meeting, with families crowding the aisles and spilling onto the front steps. Eleanor had arrived early, her best dress carefully pressed and her arguments rehearsed, hoping that reason and passion might sway minds that seemed already made up. The council members, Mayor Harrison, Banker Abernathy, Merchant Coleman, Rancher McKinnon and Preacher Davidson, had taken their seats with the weary expressions of men performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Mayor Harrison had called the meeting to order with perfunctory politeness. "We're here tonight to address the ongoing concerns about our municipal school. As you all know, we've been reviewing the financial sustainability and operational practicality of continuing education services given recent changes in circumstances." The euphemism had stung. Recent changes meant Thomas's death, her pregnancy, and the town father's conviction that a woman in her condition couldn't possibly manage 23 students without descending into chaos or scandal. Eleanor had risen when invited to speak, feeling the weight of every gaze in the crowded room. Some faces showed sympathy, parents whose children had thrived under her and Thomas's guidance. Others displayed the stern disapproval she'd grown accustomed to receiving at church socials and community gatherings. "Gentlemen," she'd begun, her voice stronger than she'd felt, "I understand your concerns about maintaining educational standards during this transition period, but I ask you to consider what we've accomplished this year. Reading scores have improved across all grade levels. 7 of our students have advanced beyond their expected academic placement. We've had no disciplinary incidents requiring outside intervention." Banker Abernathy had leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Mrs. Moore, no one questions your enthusiasm for teaching. But enthusiasm isn't sufficient for managing a classroom full of children, some of them nearly grown. Boys who might challenge a woman's authority. What happens when discipline becomes necessary? What happens when your condition makes it impossible for you to maintain order?" The phrase, "your condition," had been delivered with the delicate distaste reserved for discussing unseemly bodily functions. Eleanor had felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she'd pressed on. "I've maintained excellent discipline this year, without any assistance. The children respect boundaries because they understand the reasons behind them, not because they fear punishment. Education based on mutual respect produces better results than education based on intimidation." Preacher Davidson had cleared his throat meaningfully. "Mrs. Moore, surely you understand the impropriety of a woman in your situation continuing to teach impressionable young people. What sort of example does this set? What questions might arise in young minds about matters they shouldn't be contemplating?" The underlying accusation had been clear. Her pregnancy made her an unsuitable moral influence, a walking reminder of intimate relations that proper society preferred to ignore. Eleanor had felt the familiar anger that came from being reduced to her biology rather than judged by her competence. "Reverend Davidson, I fail to see how my widowed motherhood poses any moral threat to students who benefit from quality education. My personal circumstances don't diminish my ability to teach mathematics, literature, or geography." Mayor Harrison had shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to conclude the uncomfortable confrontation. "Mrs. Moore, the practical concerns remain. The school building requires maintenance we can no longer justify. The teacher's salary represents a significant municipal expense. Enrollment has declined as families move to larger towns with more established educational institutions." "Enrollment has declined by 3 students," Eleanor had counted. 20 students remain, and several families have expressed interest in moving to Pine Ridge specifically because of our school's reputation. Rancher McKinnon had spoken for the first time, his weathered face showing what might have been sympathy. "Ma'am, it's not personal, it's simple economics. The town can't afford to maintain a school for so few students, especially when the teacher might not be able to complete the academic year." The final vote had been swift and decisive, 5-0 in favor of immediate closure. Eleanor had listened to the verdict with numb disbelief, watching her life's work reduced to a budget line item that no longer justified its existence. As families filed out of the meeting hall, many offered awkward condolences that felt more like funeral sympathies than educational farewells. The Williamses had squeezed her hands wordlessly. Old Mrs. Patterson had whispered fierce promises to continue her granddaughter's reading lessons at home. Now standing outside in the crisp evening air, Eleanor stared at the closure notice that made everything official. Tomorrow, the school would be boarded up. Her students would face an uncertain educational future, and she would confront the terrifying prospect of raising her child in a community that had rejected both her professional competence and her personal worth. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her despair, and she looked up to see a familiar silhouette dismounting from a dusty horse. Wyatt Callan approached Eleanor with the measured stride of a man accustomed to making decisions without consulting committees or seeking approval from others. His boots scraped against the wooden steps of the town hall as he removed his hat, revealing hair that the evening breeze immediately tousled. Eleanor clutched the closure notice tighter, uncertain whether his presence meant additional complications or unexpected support. "Mrs. Moore," he said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet authority she'd noticed during their few previous encounters. "I heard what happened in there." Eleanor studied his weathered face, searching for clues about his intentions. Wyatt. Callan's reputation preceded him, a successful rancher who kept to himself, paid his debts promptly, and had little patience for social niceties. His sudden appearance felt significant, though she couldn't interpret the emotions flickering behind his steady grey eyes. "Mr. Callan." She managed a dignified nod despite her exhaustion. "I'm sorry your niece will be affected by the council's decision. Sarah has made remarkable progress this year. That's what I want to talk to you about." Wyatt glanced around the emptying town square, noting the curious glances from departing families. "Might we speak privately?" Eleanor hesitated, acutely, aware of how their conversation would be interpreted by anyone observing from nearby windows. A pregnant widow, speaking alone with an unmarried rancher, would provide enough gossip to fuel weeks of speculation. But her curiosity outweighed her concern for appearances. "We could speak in the schoolhouse," she suggested. "I still have the key." They walked the short distance in silence, Eleanor fumbling with the lock, while Wyatt waited patiently behind her. The familiar scent of chalk dust and children's books enveloped them as they entered the darkened classroom. Eleanor lit the oil lamp on her desk, casting dancing shadows across the empty student desks that tomorrow would no longer serve their intended purpose. Wyatt surveyed the room with careful attention, taking in details that Eleanor had stopped noticing years ago. The alphabet cards Thomas had hand-lettered and decorated with tiny illustrations, the world map dotted with colored pins, marking places they'd studied, the shelf of well-worn books that had transported countless young minds to distant adventures. "This is what Sarah talks about every evening," he said finally. "She describes every lesson, every story, every moment of discovery like she's sharing precious treasures." Eleanor felt a familiar warmth at the mention of her most transformed student. "Sarah has exceptional potential. Her writing shows imagination far beyond her years, and her questions demonstrate deep thinking. With continued education, she could accomplish anything she sets her mind to. That's what I'm afraid of losing." Wyatt turned to face her directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Mrs. Moore, I have a proposition that might solve both our problems." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, curious despite her wariness. "I'm listening." I'll fund the school myself. Complete operational costs. Your salary, building maintenance, supplies, everything the town council claims they can't afford. In return, you continue teaching exactly as you have been. The offer was so unexpected that Eleanor needed a moment to process its implications. Mr. Callan, that's extraordinarily generous, but the financial burden would be substantial. Teacher salaries, heating costs, textbooks, repairs. I can afford it, he interrupted matter-of-factly. The rocking sea turns a good profit, and I don't have expensive tastes. Money sitting in the bank doesn't help Sarah or any of these other children. Eleanor studied his face, searching for hidden motivations or conditions that might make his offer less appealing than it initially appeared. Why would you do this? You barely know me, and you've never shown particular interest in community affairs. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Sarah's desk in the front row. When he spoke, his voice carried an unusual vulnerability. I never learned to read properly, Mrs. Moore. Left school when I was 10 to help support my family, and pride kept me from asking for help once I'd made something of myself. I've spent 20 years working around that limitation, and it's cost me opportunities I'll never get back. The admission clearly wasn't easy for him, and Eleanor felt a surge of respect for his honesty. Many men would have hidden such perceived weakness rather than reveal it to advance their argument. Sarah's different since she started school, he continued. She reads to me in the evenings, stories, newspaper articles, anything with words. Through her, I'm finally learning what I missed. She's not just getting an education, she's sharing it with me. That's worth more than money. Eleanor felt something shift in her perception of this taciturn rancher. His proposal wasn't charity or pity, it was investment in something he truly valued. The town council might not approve of private funding. They could claim it sets a dangerous precedent. Let them disapprove, Wyatt said firmly. Private. Citizens can fund whatever they choose, and I choose to fund education. Are you willing to accept the position? Eleanor looked around the classroom that had been her life's work, imagining it filled again with eager students and purposeful activity. The offer felt too good to be true, but Wyatt's straightforward manner suggested he meant exactly what he said. She extended her hand toward him, a gesture that felt both professional and deeply personal. Mr. Callan, you have yourself a teacher. His calloused palm was warm and steady as it closed around her smaller hand, sealing an agreement that neither of them fully understood would change both their lives forever. The bronze school bell that arrived 3 days later gleamed like captured sunlight in Eleanor's hands, its surface unmarred by the weather and wear that had cracked its predecessor. Wyatt had ordered it from Denver without consulting her, arriving at the schoolhouse that morning with the bell wrapped in canvas and a quiet determination to see it properly installed before classes resumed. The old one served its purpose, he said simply, examining the damaged bell that had called Pine Ridge children to learning for nearly a decade. But it was starting to sound uncertain. Children deserve to hear confidence when school begins each day. Eleanor traced the inscription etched into the new bell's bronze surface. Education opens every door. Pine Ridge School, 1895. The words represented more than mere sentiment. They embodied the philosophy she and Thomas had always shared now, given permanent form through Wyatt's thoughtful gesture. The transformation of the schoolhouse had begun immediately after their handshake agreement. Wyatt approached the renovation with the same methodical efficiency he applied to ranch operations, arriving each morning with tools and materials that addressed problems Eleanor had learned to work around. Loose floorboards were secured with proper nails instead of the temporary wedges she'd used. Windows that had rattled in their frames for years were reglazed and weatherproofed. The pot-bellied stove, which had required constant adjustment to maintain even heat, was cleaned and fitted with new gaskets that eliminated the drafts that had made winter lessons uncomfortable. "You don't need to do all this," Eleanor had protested on the second day, watching him carefully sand rough patches on student desktops. The children managed perfectly well with things as they were. Managing isn't the same as thriving, Wyatt had replied, not pausing in his work. These children deserve the same quality environment you'd want for your own child. His matter-of-fact reference to her pregnancy had surprised her. Most people either ignored her condition entirely or discussed it in euphemisms that emphasized their discomfort. Wyatt's straightforward acknowledgement felt refreshingly honest. The community's reaction to the school's resurrection had been mixed and vocal. Sarah Williams had arrived with a basket of fresh bread and her unqualified approval. "Thank the Lord, someone had the sense to keep this school open," she'd declared, arranging the loaves on Eleanor's desk. "These children need education more than the town council needs to pinch pennies." But approval wasn't universal. Eleanor had overheard Mrs. Abernathy's sharp whispers outside the general store. "It's unseemly. An unmarried man involving himself so intimately in a pregnant widow's affairs. Mark my words, there's more to this arrangement than concern for education." The gossip stung, but Eleanor found herself caring less about public opinion than she'd expected. Wyatt's actions spoke louder than speculation about his motives. He worked with the focused dedication of someone who understood the value of what they were preserving. Sarah Callan had become a regular visitor during the restoration work, her uncle allowing her to help with simple tasks like organizing supplies and cleaning chalkboards. The girl's joy at the school's salvation was infectious, and her chatter filled the workspace with the kind of enthusiastic planning that made the future feel possible again. "Mrs. Moore, will you still read to us every afternoon?" Sarah had asked, while polishing the brass fittings on the new desks Wyatt had commissioned from the town carpenter. "Uncle Wyatt says the stories help me with my own writing, and I have 3 new tales I want to share." "Of course we'll continue our reading time," Eleanor had assured her. "In fact, I was thinking we might start a more advanced literature program for students who are ready for chapter books." Sarah's eyes had lit up with the hunger for learning that Eleanor recognized in her most promising students. "Could we read Little Women? I saw it in the catalogue from the book company in Denver." Eleanor had glanced at Wyatt, who was listening to their conversation while installing new window latches. The slight smile that crossed his weathered features told her that Sarah's request had his approval, even if he couldn't read the book himself. "We'll add it to our book order," Eleanor had promised, making a mental note to include several copies so interested students could follow along with the text during group readings. The most significant change wasn't physical but atmospheric. The school that had felt like a failing institution now hummed with renewed purpose. Eleanor found herself staying later each afternoon, not from obligation but from excitement about the possibilities that proper resources would create. She could implement the advanced mathematics curriculum she'd always wanted to try. She could expand their science lessons with equipment that would make abstract concepts tangible. She could create the kind of educational environment that would prepare these rural children to compete with their urban counterparts. As the bronze bell caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the newly cleaned windows, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death: genuine optimism about the future. The bell would call children to learning, but it also announced something more significant: the birth of a partnership that valued education above convention, substance above appearance, and potential above prejudice. Wyatt secured the final bracket that would hold the bell in its tower, testing the rope that would allow Eleanor to ring it each morning. The clear, confident tone that resulted seemed to echo across the entire valley, announcing that Pine Ridge School was not merely surviving, but preparing to flourish. The anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath Eleanor's cottage door during the pre-dawn hours when decent people were still asleep. The paper was cheap, the handwriting deliberately disguised, but the message was crystal clear in its cruelty. "Decent women don't accept charity from unmarried men. Your arrangement with Callan brings shame on our community. Find yourself a husband or find yourself another town. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the unsigned threats, each word designed to wound and intimidate. The letter represented more than one person's disapproval. It embodied the whispered conversations that ceased when she entered rooms, the pointed glances that followed her through the general store, the systematic campaign to make her feel unwelcome in the community she'd served faithfully for years. The harassment had begun subtly. Families who had previously greeted her warmly at church now offered only stiff nods. Former allies like Mrs. Patterson, whose granddaughter had thrived under Eleanor's instruction, suddenly found reasons to avoid extended conversations. Even Reverend Davidson's Sunday sermons had begun, including pointed references to the importance of proper Christian conduct and the dangers of unseemly associations between men and women. Eleanor had initially tried to ignore the social pressure, focusing on preparing lesson plans and organizing the classroom for the upcoming term. But isolation wore on her spirit like water against stone, gradually eroding her confidence and sense of belonging. The pregnancy made everything worse. Her changing body drew attention she didn't want, while her emotional vulnerability left her less equipped to handle criticism that would have rolled off her shoulders months earlier. The letter's arrival coincided with her darkest period of self-doubt. Perhaps the town council had been right about her inability to manage alone. Perhaps accepting Wyatt's support did create an improper appearance that undermined her moral authority as a teacher. Perhaps her determination to continue working while pregnant was selfish rather than admirable. Wyatt found her crying over the breakfast dishes that afternoon. The threatening letter crumpled on the kitchen table beside her untouched meal. His knock had been gentle but persistent, and when she'd finally opened the door, he'd taken one look at her tear-stained face and stepped inside without invitation. "What's happened?" he asked simply, his grey eyes scanning the room for signs of trouble. Eleanor gestured helplessly toward the letter, unable to speak without risking fresh tears. Wyatt read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each sentence. When he finished, he carefully smoothed the wrinkled paper and set it aside with deliberate control. "Cowards write anonymous letters," he said quietly. "Brave people sign their names to their opinions." "Maybe they're right," Eleanor whispered, sinking into her kitchen chair. "Maybe I'm being foolish to think I can continue teaching in my condition. Maybe the arrangement between us does look improper to decent people." Wyatt pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his presence solid and reassuring in her small kitchen. "Mrs. Moore, do you believe you're a good teacher?" Yes, I think so. "Do you believe Sarah and the other children benefit from your instruction?" "Yes, but do you believe education is important enough to fight for, even when small-minded?" "People try to tear it down." Eleanor met his steady gaze, finding strength in his unwavering confidence. "Yes, I do believe that. Then we continue." Simple as that. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, his tone matter-of-fact. "People who have nothing better to do than write anonymous letters aren't worth worrying about. People who judge a woman's worth by her marital status instead of her character don't deserve to influence important decisions. But the gossip will die down once they find something new to talk about," Wyatt interrupted. "Small towns always need someone to whisper about. Better it should be us doing something worthwhile than someone else doing something actually shameful." Eleanor felt some of her burden lifting under his pragmatic approach. "You're not concerned about your reputation being linked to mine?" A rare smile tugged at the corner of Wyatt's mouth. "Ma'am, my reputation was built on minding my own business and expecting others to do the same. Anyone who knows me knows I don't make decisions based on other people's opinions." "The letter mentioned finding a husband," Eleanor said quietly, heat rising in her cheeks. "As if that would solve everything." "Would it solve everything?" Wyatt asked, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "No, marriage wouldn't make me a better teacher or give me more knowledge to share with students. It would just satisfy people who believe women need male supervision to function properly. Then marriage isn't the solution we're looking for." Wyatt concluded. Education is. Everything else is just noise. As he prepared to leave, Wyatt paused at the door. Mrs. Moore, people who try to tear down good things usually do it because they're jealous of what others have built. Don't let their jealousy stop you from building something beautiful. After he left, Eleanor reread the anonymous letter with different eyes. The words still hurt, but they no longer carried the power to make her question her path. The carved wooden cradle sat hidden beneath a canvas tarp in Wyatt's workshop, its smooth pine surfaces glowing with the warm patina that came from careful hand finishing. He'd worked on it during the quiet evening hours, when Sarah was occupied with her homework and the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse. Each curve of the rockers had been shaped with patient attention, each joint fitted with the precision of a man who understood that some projects demanded perfection. The cradle represented something Wyatt couldn't easily express in words, a growing investment in Eleanor's future that went far beyond his original commitment to fund the school. Somewhere between their handshake agreement and these autumn evenings spent improving the schoolhouse together, his concern for Sarah's education had expanded to include genuine care for Eleanor's well-being and that of her unborn child. The shift had happened gradually, like the changing seasons in the mountain valley. What had begun as a business arrangement, his funding in exchange for Sarah's continued education, had evolved into something more personal through countless small interactions. Eleanor's quiet gratitude when he'd repaired the schoolhouse steps without being asked, her patient instruction when he'd shyly requested help understanding a contract that required more reading skill than he possessed. The way she instinctively included him in conversations about Sarah's progress, treating him as a partner in the girl's development rather than simply her guardian. Uncle Wyatt, you're cutting those boards awfully straight for fence posts, Sarah observed one evening, peering into the workshop where he'd been secretly crafting the cradle's sides. Her 8-year-old curiosity was sharp, and Wyatt had learned to expect penetrating questions about any project that seemed unusual. Good habit to develop, he'd replied carefully, positioning his body to block her view of the cradle's emerging shape. Straight cuts make strong joints no matter what you're building. Sarah had accepted this explanation with the trust she'd come to place in his practical wisdom, but her knowing smile suggested she suspected something more interesting. Then fence repairs was occupying his evening hours. The evening reading sessions had become Wyatt's favorite part of each day. After supper, Sarah would settle beside him on the front porch with whatever book Mrs. Moore had assigned for home reading. Her clear young voice would bring stories to life while Wyatt followed along, gradually connecting the mysterious symbols on the page with the words he'd heard spoken all his life. The wind in the willows whispered secrets that only Rat could understand. Sarah read from their current selection, pausing to ensure her uncle was keeping pace with the text. What do you think the secrets were about, Uncle Wyatt? These questions had initially frustrated him. How could he speculate about fictional mysteries when he could barely sound out the individual words? But Eleanor's coaching had taught him that reading comprehension involved more than mechanical skill. Well, he'd learned to respond, what do you think? Writers usually give clues about important things. Through these discussions, Wyatt discovered that his life experience provided valuable context for understanding stories, even when the actual reading remained challenging. His knowledge of animal behavior helped him appreciate the accuracy of Kenneth Graham's wildlife descriptions. His understanding of human nature allowed him to predict character motivations that sometimes surprised Sarah with their insight. Eleanor had begun joining their evening sessions, arriving at the ranch house after completing her daily lesson preparations. She would listen to Sarah's reading, offer gentle corrections when needed, and gradually draw Wyatt into more complex discussions about the books they shared. Mr. Callan, you have excellent instincts about character development, she'd observed, after he'd correctly predicted a plot twist in their current novel. Your insights show that literacy involves much more than recognizing words on a page. Her praise had warmed him more than he'd expected. After years of hiding his educational limitations, having someone acknowledge his intellectual capabilities felt like discovering a talent he'd never known he possessed. The growing intimacy of these shared evenings had created a comfortable routine that felt remarkably like family life. Sarah would curl up between them on the porch swing, her homework spread across her lap, while they discussed everything from arithmetic problems to the philosophical questions raised by their reading selections. Eleanor's pregnancy had become more visible, and Wyatt found himself automatically adjusting cushions for her comfort, fetching glasses of water without being asked, and ensuring she had adequate light for grading papers. "You don't need to fuss over me," Eleanor had protested, one evening when he'd brought her a shawl against the cooling mountain air. "Not fussing," he'd replied simply, "just being neighborly." But they both knew it had become more than neighborly concern. The careful attention they paid to each other's comfort, the way their conversations continued long after Sarah had fallen asleep, the increasing frequency of their glances meeting across the shared reading material, all suggested feelings that neither was quite ready to acknowledge openly. The cradle waiting in his workshop represented Wyatt's unspoken hope that their unusual partnership might evolve into something permanent and wonderful. Each carefully smoothed edge reflected his growing conviction that Eleanor and her child deserved a future filled with security, respect, and love. Things he found himself wanting to provide more each day. As he applied the final coat of finish to the cradle's wooden surfaces, Wyatt allowed himself to imagine a future where anonymous letters and community gossip couldn't threaten the family. They were slowly, carefully building together. The letter from Wyatt's deceased brother James had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had worn soft as fabric, the ink fading but still legible in the lamplight of the ranch house parlor. Eleanor held the precious document carefully, understanding that Wyatt was sharing something deeply personal, perhaps the most important piece of writing in his possession, despite his struggles with literacy. "James wrote this 2 days before the mine accident," Wyatt said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of grief that 3 years hadn't fully healed. "Had one of the other miners read it to me when I came to collect Sarah. Been carrying it ever since." Eleanor's eyes traced the familiar handwriting. James had clearly shared his brother's challenges with formal education, but his words carried unmistakable love and desperation. "My dear brother," the letter began, "if something happens to me, promise you'll give Sarah the chances we never had. She's got a quick mind that shouldn't be wasted like ours were. Education opens doors that stay locked for people like us. Don't let her grow up ignorant just because we did." The letter continued with specific requests about Sarah's upbringing, but it was the final paragraph that revealed the depth of James's regret. "I know you think book learning doesn't matter for practical folk, but I've watched educated men make fortunes while we break our backs for wages. Sarah deserves better. Make sure she gets proper schooling, even if you have to move heaven and earth to provide it. She's our family's hope for something greater." He was always the dreamer between us, Wyatt said, settling into the chair beside Eleanor as Sarah played quietly with her dolls in the corner. "I thought hard work and honest dealing were enough to get ahead in the world. James understood that knowledge was power in ways I didn't appreciate until it was too late." Eleanor carefully refolded the letter, recognizing the sacred trust it represented. "He loved her very much, and he trusted you to fulfill his dreams for her future. That's why I couldn't let the school close," Wyatt admitted. "Sarah's not just my responsibility. She's my chance to honor the promise I made to my brother. When I see her reading stories or working arithmetic problems, I feel like James is watching, proud that his daughter is getting opportunities we never imagined." The conversation had begun when Eleanor had commented on Wyatt's remarkable dedication to Sarah's education. wondering aloud what had inspired such commitment from a man who'd initially seemed indifferent to academic pursuits. His willingness to share James's letter revealed a vulnerability she hadn't expected from the self-contained rancher. "What about your own dreams?" Eleanor asked gently. "What did you want when you were young, before circumstances forced you to focus on survival?" Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Sarah's innocent play. "I wanted to understand things. Maps, newspapers, books, all the written knowledge that seemed like secret codes I couldn't crack. I'd watch educated men in Chicago, making decisions that affected hundreds of workers, knowing they had access to information that was invisible to people like me." "It's not too late," Eleanor said softly. "Learning doesn't have age limits. You've already made remarkable progress during our evening sessions." "Maybe," Wyatt said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Sometimes I wonder if my brain is too set in its ways to absorb new knowledge properly." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression earnest. "Mr. Callan, you have one of the sharpest minds I've encountered. Your insights during our reading discussions often surpass those of formally educated people. Intelligence isn't about how young you were when you learned to read. It's about how you think and reason and solve problems." The sincerity in her. A voice seemed to touch something deep in Wyatt's guarded heart. "You really believe that?" "I know it," Eleanor replied firmly. "I've watched you analyze complex business situations, manage dozens of employees, and make strategic decisions that have built a successful enterprise. Those skills require exactly the same intellectual capabilities that formal education develops." Sarah looked up from her dolls, apparently listening to more of their conversation than they'd realized. "Uncle Wyatt is the smartest person I know," she declared with 8-year-old certainty. "He knows about everything, animals and weather and fixing broken things. Mrs. Moore just taught him to read about things he already understood." The simple wisdom of a child's observation brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. Out of the mouths of babes came truths that adults often complicated with unnecessary self-doubt and social prejudice. "That's exactly right, Sarah," Eleanor agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "Your uncle has always been intelligent. He just needed someone to help him access the written knowledge that matches his natural wisdom." Wyatt cleared his throat, clearly moved by both Sarah's defense and Eleanor's faith in his capabilities. "Well, I reckon we all have things to learn and things to teach each other." As he carefully returned James's letter to his shirt pocket, Eleanor understood that they'd crossed another threshold in their relationship, from professional partnership to personal trust, from mutual respect to something approaching love. The petition for Eleanor's removal bore 23 signatures, each name written in careful script that transformed neighbors and former friends into formal opponents. Mrs. Abernathy had presented the document to Mayor Harrison with the ceremonious gravity of someone delivering a legal verdict, her satisfaction evident as she unfolded the paper on his mahogany desk. "As you can see, Mayor Harrison, a significant portion of our community has serious concerns about the current educational arrangement," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who viewed herself as the town's moral guardian. "We believe immediate action is necessary to protect our children from inappropriate influence." Eleanor had learned about the petition through Sarah Williams, who'd arrived at the schoolhouse that morning with barely contained outrage and a detailed account of the previous evening's gathering at the Abernathy residence. "They called it a concerned parents' meeting," Sarah reported indignantly, "but it was nothing more than a coordinated attack on your character and reputation." The petition's language was carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations while implying serious impropriety. "We, the undersigned citizens of Pine Ridge, respectfully request the immediate appointment of a qualified male teacher to replace Mrs. Eleanor Moore, whose current circumstances and associations have created concerns about the moral environment of our children's education." The document continued, with vague references to unseemly arrangements and questions of proper Christian conduct that allowed signatories to express disapproval without making specific charges they couldn't substantiate. What hurt most wasn't the petition itself, but the names attached to it. Mrs. Patterson, whose granddaughter had struggled with reading until Eleanor's patient intervention transformed her into a confident student. Mr. Coleman, who'd praised Eleanor's innovative mathematics instruction just months earlier. Even Mrs. Davidson, the preacher's wife, had added her signature despite her husband's previous support for the school's educational mission. "Some of these people have children in my classroom," Eleanor said quietly, studying the familiar handwriting with disbelief. "How can they demand my removal while sending their children to learn from me every day?" Sarah Williams shook her head grimly. "Fear makes people do foolish things. They're more afraid of gossip than they are committed to their children's education." The economic pressure had begun shortly after the petition's presentation. Mr. Abernathy had quietly suggested to several of Wyatt's business associates that continued association with the Callan situation might reflect poorly on their own reputations. Suppliers who'd previously competed for the Rocking Seas business suddenly found reasons to delay deliveries or increase prices. The banker's subtle campaign of professional isolation was designed to make Wyatt's support of the school financially costly. But Wyatt's response had been characteristically direct. When approached by nervous business partners seeking reassurance about his controversial activities, he'd made his position clear. "My business relationships are based on mutual benefit and honest dealing. Anyone who wants to end those relationships over personal matters they don't understand is welcome to do so. I won't have trouble finding partners who judge me by my actions rather than other people's gossip." The children caught in the middle suffered most from the adult tensions. Students whose parents had signed the petition arrived at school with confused expressions and conflicted loyalties. They loved Mrs. Moore and enjoyed learning, but they'd overheard enough adult conversations to understand that their attendance somehow involved them in community controversy they didn't comprehend. Young Timothy Coleman had tearfully approached Eleanor after arithmetic class. "Mrs. Moore, is it true you're going to stop being our teacher because my pa thinks you're a bad person?" Eleanor had knelt beside his desk, choosing her words carefully. "Timothy, your father loves you and wants what's best for you. Sometimes adults disagree about complicated things, but that doesn't change how much we all care about your education and happiness. But you're not a bad person," Timothy had insisted, with the moral clarity that children possessed before adults. Taught them to compromise their convictions. "You're the best teacher we've ever had." The petition represented more than individual signatures. It embodied the community's resistance to change, their discomfort with unconventional arrangements, and their preference for familiar prejudices over educational innovation. Eleanor understood that the document would be presented as evidence of widespread concern, justifying official intervention in her professional life. As she prepared for the inevitable confrontation with town authorities, Eleanor found strength in remembering the children who depended on her instruction and the promise she'd made to Thomas about continuing their shared educational mission. The signatures on the petition might represent community pressure, but they also revealed which people were willing to sacrifice children's futures to maintain their own comfort with social conventions. The battle for the school's survival had escalated beyond individual prejudice to organized opposition, but Eleanor was no longer the isolated widow who'd first faced the town council months earlier. Eleanor's careful handwriting filled every page of the Christmas program script, each scene crafted to showcase her students' academic growth while celebrating the season's spirit of hope and renewal. The handwritten manuscript had become her secret weapon against community criticism, a tangible demonstration of what Pine Ridge children could achieve when given proper educational support and high expectations. A Prairie Christmas, Stories of community and faith would feature every student in speaking roles that highlighted their individual strengths. Sarah Callan would narrate the opening scene, her clear voice and confident delivery proving how far she'd traveled from the frightened child who'd arrived at school, barely able to whisper her own name. Timothy Coleman would demonstrate his mathematical skills by calculating the gifts in the 12 Days of Christmas, turning a familiar song into an arithmetic lesson that made learning entertaining. The weeks of preparation had transformed the one-room schoolhouse into a theater of possibility. Students arrived early each morning to practice their lines, their excitement infectious as they helped each other with costumes and stage movements. Even the children whose parents had signed the petition threw themselves into rehearsals with unbridled enthusiasm, temporarily forgetting the adult tensions that complicated their school attendance. "Mrs. Moore, should I speak louder during my poetry recitation?" asked Mary Patterson, whose grandmother had been among the petition signatories. The 12-year-old's question carried no awareness of the adult politics surrounding her education. She simply wanted to perform well for the teacher who'd helped her discover a love of literature. "Project your voice to the back row, Mary, but remember that feeling is more important than volume," Eleanor coached gently. "Your understanding of the poem's meaning will help the audience connect with its message." The program's centerpiece would be a tableau depicting the town's founding, with students portraying the original settlers who'd chosen education as one of their first community priorities. Eleanor had researched the historical records, discovering that Pine Ridge's founders had established the school before building a proper church or town hall, recognizing that knowledge was essential for their children's futures. "When our great-grandparents first arrived in this valley," Sarah would recite in her opening narration, "they faced harsh winters, difficult farming conditions, and isolation from the civilized world. But they understood that education was the foundation upon which all other progress would be built." The school they established wasn't just a building, it was their gift to future generations. The historical parallels weren't accidental. Eleanor hoped that reminding the community of their educational heritage would encourage them to reconsider their current opposition to the school's continuation. If the original settlers had prioritized learning, despite far greater hardships, surely their descendants could support a teacher whose only crime was accepting help from an unmarried benefactor. Wyatt had become an unexpected ally in the program's preparation, contributing both labor and materials with quiet efficiency. He'd built a portable stage that could be assembled in the schoolhouse, allowing for proper theatrical presentations. His carpentry skills had produced scenery panels depicting prairie landscapes and frontier buildings that provided professional quality backdrops for the children's performances. "Uncle Wyatt, you made this look just like a real theater," Sarah had marveled while examining the painted scenery. "How did you know how to create something so beautiful?" "Sometimes you have to imagine what something could be before you can build it," Wyatt had replied, unconsciously describing the philosophy that guided his relationship with Eleanor and the school. The evening of the program arrived with December snow falling gently outside the warm, lamp-lit schoolhouse. Parents and community members filled every available seat, their presence creating the largest gathering the school had hosted since its original dedication ceremony. Even some petition signatories attended, perhaps drawn by curiosity or parental pride stronger than their political objections. Eleanor watched from the side as her students took the makeshift stage, their nervous energy transforming into confident performance as they began sharing the fruits of their education. Sarah's narration was flawless, her voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room. Timothy's mathematical demonstration drew appreciative chuckles from parents who hadn't realized their children were learning such advanced concepts. Mary Patterson's poetry recitation brought tears to several eyes, including those of her conflicted grandmother. The historical tableau proved particularly powerful, with students dressed as their own ancestors, recreating the decision to establish Pine Ridge's first school. As the young actors spoke about the importance of education for frontier survival, Eleanor noticed thoughtful expressions on several faces that had previously shown only disapproval. The program's climax featured all 20 students singing Silent Night in three-part harmony, their young voices blending with surprising sophistication. The musical arrangement was Eleanor's own creation, adapted to showcase each child's vocal range while creating a unified expression of seasonal joy. As the final notes faded and applause filled the schoolhouse, Eleanor felt a moment of pure triumph. Her students had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything the town council had imagined possible. The education they'd received wasn't just adequate, it was exceptional, preparing them for futures limited only by their own ambitions, rather than their rural circumstances. Even Mrs. Abernathy was seen wiping tears from her eyes as she applauded her neighbor's child reciting a complex poem with genuine understanding and emotional depth. For one magical evening, the schoolhouse had become what Eleanor and Thomas had always envisioned. A place where young minds flourished and community pride in educational achievement overrode petty prejudices. The handwritten script in Eleanor's hands represented more than a Christmas program. It was proof that good teaching could transform lives and communities when given the chance to succeed. The legal documents from the Denver law firm arrived on a January morning when the mountain air was so cold it seemed to crack with each breath. Eleanor stared at the official papers with disbelief, reading Thomas's last will and testament for what felt like the 100th time. Unable to fully comprehend the transformation these pages represented for her future, Mrs. Eleanor Moore, the formal language declared, is hereby designated as sole beneficiary of the estate of Thomas Jonathan Moore, including all property, investments, and financial assets held in trust pending resolution of outstanding legal matters. The inheritance Thomas had left her, a substantial sum invested in Denver real estate and railroad stocks, had been tied up in probate court for nearly 2 years, its existence unknown to Eleanor until the legal complications had finally been resolved. The lawyer's accompanying letter explained the delay. Your late husband's business partner had contested the will's provisions, claiming joint ownership of certain investments. The Colorado Supreme Court has ruled in your favor, releasing funds totaling $3,847, plus accumulated interest and dividends. We apologize for the extended legal proceedings that delayed this settlement. Eleanor's hands trembled as she calculated the significance of this unexpected windfall. The inheritance represented more than financial security. It offered complete independence from both town council control and Wyatt's generous but potentially compromising support. She could fund the school herself, hire additional teachers, even expand the educational program beyond what Pine Ridge had ever imagined possible. But the revelation also complicated her relationship with Wyatt in ways she hadn't anticipated. Their partnership had been built on her need for his resources and his desire to ensure Sarah's education. What would happen to their growing personal connection when the practical foundation that had brought them together was no longer necessary? Sarah Williams was the first person Eleanor told about the inheritance, needing a trusted friend's perspective on this dramatic change in circumstances. They sat in Eleanor's cottage kitchen, the legal documents spread across the scrubbed wooden table like maps to an uncertain future. It's wonderful news, of course, Sarah said carefully, but I can see why you're troubled. Will this change things between you and Wyatt? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. Our entire relationship has been based on his funding the school because I couldn't afford to do it myself. Now that I can be completely self-sufficient, what reason would he have to continue his involvement? Perhaps his reasons have changed. Over these past months, Sarah suggested gently, a man doesn't spend his evenings teaching himself to read just to ensure his niece gets an education. He could send Sarah to school in Denver if that were his only concern. Eleanor had considered this possibility, but feared building hopes on assumptions that might prove false. Wyatt was a practical man who made decisions based on clear benefits and logical outcomes. Their evening reading sessions and comfortable domestic routines might simply represent the convenience of an efficient arrangement rather than evidence of deeper feelings. The news of Eleanor's inheritance spread through Pine Ridge with the speed of wildfire, transforming community perceptions overnight. The pregnant widow, who'd been pitied as a dependent charity case, suddenly became an independent woman of means whose educational vision deserved serious consideration. People who'd viewed her relationship with Wyatt as potentially scandalous now saw it as a partnership between equals rather than a patron and dependent arrangement. Mrs. Abernathy, who'd led the petition drive against Eleanor's continued employment, suddenly discovered reasons to visit the schoolhouse with offers of assistance and friendship. "I always believed in your teaching abilities, Mrs. Moore," she claimed with breathtaking revisionism. "My concerns were simply about the financial sustainability of the educational program." Eleanor received these sudden reversals of opinion with polite skepticism, understanding that community support based on her financial status was far less reliable than opposition based on moral conviction. People who change their minds about her worth based on her bank account might just as easily change them again if circumstances shifted. The most difficult conversation was with Wyatt himself. Eleanor had asked him to visit the cottage that evening, ostensibly to discuss Sarah's spring curriculum, but actually to reveal the inheritance and explore its implications for their future relationship. "This changes everything," she said simply, placing the legal documents on the table between them. "I can fund the school independently now. I no longer need your financial support." Wyatt read through the inheritance papers with his improving literacy skills, taking time to absorb their full meaning. When he looked up, his grey eyes were unreadable. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "This gives you the independence you deserve. You'll be able to run the school exactly as you see fit, without anyone questioning your decisions or your methods." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, though the word felt hollow. "Complete independence." They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that the practical foundation of their partnership had just shifted dramatically. The question now was whether the personal connection they'd built could survive without the mutual need that had originally brought them together. "So what happens now?" Wyatt finally asked, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor looked into his weathered face, searching for clues about his feelings while trying to understand her own. "I honestly don't know." Dr. William Hayes set down his medical bag with the deliberate movements of a man delivering unwelcome news. His examination of Eleanor had been thorough but gentle, his weathered hands checking her pulse and listening to the baby's heartbeat with professional concern that couldn't quite mask his growing worry. The written medical report he now prepared would become the ammunition her opponents needed to force her from the classroom. "Mrs. Moore, I must be frank with you," Dr. Hayes said, his fountain pen scratching across the official letterhead as he documented his findings. "Your blood pressure has elevated significantly since my last examination. The swelling in your hands and feet, combined with your advanced pregnancy, creates genuine risks that I cannot ignore as your physician." Eleanor watched him complete the medical report, understanding that each careful word would be scrutinized by town officials looking for justification to close the school again. Dr. Hayes was a good man who delivered half the children in Pine Ridge, but his professional obligations required him to prioritize her health over her career aspirations. "Doctor, I feel perfectly capable of continuing my teaching duties," Eleanor protested, though she couldn't deny the exhaustion that had been weighing on her more heavily each day. "The children depend on consistent instruction, especially with spring examinations approaching. I understand your dedication, but I must recommend immediate reduction in physical activity and stress," Dr. Hayes replied firmly. "Teaching 23 children while 7 months pregnant, particularly given the community tension surrounding your position, represents exactly the kind of strain that could endanger both you and your baby. The medical report's formal language transformed Eleanor's daily struggles into clinical concerns that demanded official response. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with pregnancy-induced hypertension. Continued exposure to stressful working conditions could result in serious complications requiring emergency intervention. Immediate cessation of employment responsibilities strongly recommended. Word of Dr. Hayes's medical recommendations reached the town council before Eleanor had even returned home from her appointment. Mayor Harrison arrived at her cottage that evening with the grim efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary duty, accompanied by two council members who served as witnesses to the official conversation. Mrs. Moore, Dr. Hayes, has shared his medical concerns with the council, Mayor Harrison began, his tone attempting diplomacy while delivering an ultimatum. We simply cannot accept responsibility for educational services that might endanger your health or that of your unborn child. The doctor recommended reduced activity, not complete cessation of work, Eleanor countered, though she recognized the futility of arguing against predetermined conclusions. I could modify my teaching schedule or reduce classroom hours while maintaining educational continuity. Councilmember Davidson shook his head firmly. Ma'am, we've received too many complaints from concerned parents to justify continuing this arrangement. Combined with medical evidence that your condition poses risks, we have no choice but to suspend school operations until alternative arrangements can be made. The suspension felt like a death sentence for everything Eleanor had worked to build. Her inheritance had given her financial independence, but it couldn't protect her from the biological reality of pregnancy or the community's determination to use her condition as justification for ending her career. Wyatt found her sitting at her kitchen table that night, staring at Dr. Hayes's medical report with the hollow expression of someone whose world had just collapsed. The strong, determined woman who'd fought the town council and rebuilt the school had been replaced by someone who looked fragile and defeated. The children don't understand why they can't come to school tomorrow, Eleanor said quietly, not looking up from the damning medical document. Sarah came by this afternoon asking if she'd done something wrong. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that adults can destroy something beautiful because they're afraid of change? Wyatt sat across from her, his presence solid and comforting, in the cottage that suddenly felt too small for the weight of their shared disappointment. This isn't over, Eleanor. Medical concerns are temporary. Once the baby comes and you've recovered, you can reopen the school. Can I? Eleanor's voice carried a bitterness Wyatt had never heard before. The town council has what they wanted, medical justification for closing the school. Even after I recover, they'll find other reasons. I'm a single mother now, which carries its own social stigma. They'll claim I can't manage both motherhood and teaching, or that my baby would be a distraction in the classroom. The defeated tone in her voice alarmed Wyatt more than her medical condition had. The Eleanor he'd come to admire was a fighter who faced obstacles with determination and creativity. This broken woman, contemplating surrender, represented a crisis. Deeper than physical health concerns. What about your inheritance? He asked gently. You have the resources to operate independently of town council approval. Eleanor laughed bitterly. Money can't buy community acceptance or parental trust. What good is funding a school if families won't send their children? What purpose does education serve if society won't allow educated women to use their knowledge? As night settled over the mountain valley, Eleanor stared at the medical report that had become her educational death warrant, wondering if the dreams she'd shared with Thomas were simply too idealistic for the harsh realities of frontier life. The bundle of 23 letters, each written in a child's careful handwriting, lay spread across the town hall table like evidence in a trial that would determine the future of education in Pine Ridge. Sarah Callan had organized the letter writing campaign without adult supervision, instinctively understanding that children's voices might carry weight that adult arguments had failed to achieve. We, the students of Pine Ridge School, want to tell you why Mrs. Moore should keep teaching us, began Timothy Coleman's letter, his 9-year-old logic cutting through adult complications with devastating simplicity. She makes learning fun and helps us understand hard things. My arithmetic has gotten so much better that Pa says I can help him with the store accounts. That's because Mrs. Moore taught me that numbers tell stories about real life. The emergency town meeting had been called at the insistence of Mayor Harrison, who'd grown tired of the constant controversy surrounding the school. The hall was packed beyond capacity, with families standing in the aisles and spilling onto the front steps. The tension was palpable. Months of gossip and political maneuvering had divided the community into irreconcilable camps. Eleanor sat in the front row, her pregnancy now obvious despite her carefully chosen dress. The medical report Dr. Hayes had prepared lay before the council members like a sword of Damocles, ready to fall at any moment. But beside her sat an unexpected ally, Wyatt Callan, dressed in his best suit and prepared to make the most important speech of his life. Sarah's letter, written in her careful script, was perhaps the most powerful. Mrs. Moore saved me from being scared and silent. When I first came to school, I couldn't talk to anyone because I was afraid they would think I was stupid. Mrs. Moore showed me that questions are how we learn and that making mistakes is how we get better. She taught me that words have power to tell stories and change how people think. If you take her away from us, you're taking away the person who helps us find our voices. Mayor Harrison called the meeting to order with visible reluctance. We're here tonight to make a final decision about the school situation. Dr. Hayes has provided medical evidence that Mrs. Moore's continued teaching poses health risks. Several families have expressed ongoing concerns about the educational environment. The council must consider all factors in making this determination. Mrs. Williams stood up without waiting for permission to speak. "I'd like to read something," she announced, holding up her daughter's letter. "My Emma wrote this to explain why she wants to keep learning from Mrs. Moore." The letter detailed how Eleanor's patient instruction had helped Emma overcome her fear of reading aloud, transforming a shy child into a confident student who now volunteered to share stories with the class. One by one, parents began standing to read their children's letters. Mr. Patterson, whose mother had signed the petition against Eleanor, read his daughter's passionate defense of the teacher who'd helped her discover a love of poetry. Even some petition signatories found themselves moved by their own children's words, forced to confront the disconnect between their political positions and their children's educational experiences. The turning point came when Wyatt rose to address the assembly. His presence commanded attention. The successful rancher who'd funded the school's continuation was finally speaking publicly about his motivations and intentions. "Folks, I'm not a man who makes speeches," he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the crowded hall. "But I've got things to say that need hearing." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. 6 months ago, I couldn't read much beyond my own name. I was ashamed of that limitation, but I'd learned to work around it. Then I watched what Mrs. Moore's teaching did for my niece Sarah, and I realized I'd been settling for less than I could be. The audience listened with rapt attention as Wyatt described his evening reading sessions with Sarah, his growing literacy, and his understanding of education's transformative power. "Mrs. Moore doesn't just teach children to read and write," he continued. "She teaches them to think, to question, to imagine possibilities beyond their current circumstances. That's the kind of education that builds strong communities and successful lives." Then came the moment that surprised everyone, including Eleanor herself. Wyatt turned to face her directly, his grey eyes steady and determined. "Mrs. Moore, I've got something to ask you, and I figured doing it publicly might help folks understand that my support for you and this school isn't charity or convenience. It's love." Eleanor's heart stopped as Wyatt knelt beside her chair, producing a simple gold band from his vest pocket. "Eleanor Moore, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and help me build a life where education and family and community support each other?" The hall fell completely silent. The political maneuvering and medical concerns suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the simple human drama unfolding before them. Eleanor stared at the ring, understanding that Wyatt's proposal wasn't just about their personal relationship, it was a public declaration that would reframe the entire school controversy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, I'll marry you." The transformation was immediate. Scattered applause broke out across the hall as people realized they were witnessing not just a proposal, but a solution to the community's educational dilemma. A married couple running the school together would satisfy the propriety concerns that had fueled much of the opposition. Mayor Harrison banged his gavel for order. "Well, this certainly changes things. Perhaps we should table this discussion until the community has time to consider these new developments." But Sarah Williams stood up again, her voice carrying new authority. "I move that we vote right now on whether Pine Ridge School should continue operating with Mrs. Moore, soon to be Mrs. Callan, as our teacher." The vote, when it came, was overwhelming. 18 in favor, 5 opposed. The children's letters had accomplished what months of adult arguments had failed to achieve, and Wyatt's proposal had provided the social framework that made Eleanor's continued teaching acceptable to the community's moral standards. The simple gold wedding ring gleamed on Eleanor's finger as she stood beside Wyatt in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the schoolhouse windows. Reverend Davidson had agreed to perform the ceremony in the classroom, where their partnership had first taken root, surrounded by the desks and books that represented their shared commitment to education and community. Sarah Callan, radiant in her role as both flower girl and witness to her uncle's happiness, scattered rose petals from the garden behind Eleanor's cottage. The 8-year-old had sewn the petals into small fabric pouches the night before, determined that this wedding should be as beautiful as any ceremony described in the romantic novels she'd begun reading under Eleanor's guidance. "Do you, Wyatt? Cullen, take Eleanor Moore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live." Reverend Davidson's voice carried the weight of formal ritual, but his eyes showed genuine warmth for the couple whose unconventional courtship had ultimately strengthened the entire community. "I do," Wyatt replied firmly, his calloused hands gentle as he slipped the matching gold band onto Eleanor's finger. The ring represented more than marriage vows. It symbolized the union of their dreams, their resources, and their commitment to creating something lasting and valuable together. Eleanor's response came through tears of joy that had been building. Since the moment Wyatt had knelt beside her chair in the town hall. "I do," she whispered, then more strongly, "I absolutely do." The small gathering of witnesses included many who had opposed their relationship just weeks earlier. Mrs. Abernathy dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, apparently moved by the romance she'd previously condemned as improper. Mayor Harrison beamed with the satisfaction of someone who'd helped orchestrate a happy ending to months of community conflict. But the most important witness was time itself. Eleanor had married Thomas in the passionate enthusiasm of young love, when the future seemed limitless and obstacles appeared conquerable through sheer determination. This marriage to Wyatt was different, built on mutual respect, shared trials, and the mature understanding that love could grow stronger through adversity rather than despite it. The wedding breakfast was held in the schoolhouse, with tables arranged between the student desks and food provided by families who wanted to celebrate the resolution of the town's educational crisis. Sarah Williams had organized the meal with military precision, ensuring that even former opponents felt welcome to participate in the community reconciliation that the marriage represented. To Mr. and Mrs. Callan, proposed Mr. Patterson, raising his coffee cup in a toast that would have been unthinkable months earlier. May your marriage be as successful as your school, and may Pine Ridge benefit from both for many years to come. The toast was echoed throughout the room, creating a moment of genuine unity that transcended the political divisions that had nearly destroyed the school. Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction as she looked around the classroom filled with friends and neighbors, understanding that education had ultimately triumphed over prejudice through the simple power of demonstrated value. But the day's most significant moment came when Dr. Hayes arrived with news about Eleanor's medical condition and the implications for her continued teaching. He'd been monitoring her health closely since the crisis that had nearly ended her career, and his latest examination had revealed encouraging developments. "Mrs. Callan," he announced with professional satisfaction, "your blood pressure has stabilized significantly since our last meeting. The reduction in stress appears to have had immediate positive effects on both your health and the baby's development." Eleanor understood the deeper meaning of his words: the security of marriage, the resolution of the school controversy, and the community's acceptance had eliminated the anxiety that had been endangering her pregnancy. Love and stability had proven to be better medicine than enforced rest and isolation. The afternoon brought the moment Eleanor had been anticipating with both excitement and nervousness, introducing Sarah to the idea that she would soon have a new sibling. The girl had been thriving as the center of attention in their makeshift family, and Eleanor worried about how she might react to sharing that attention with a baby. "Sarah," Eleanor said gently, drawing the child aside while Wyatt cleaned up after the wedding celebration, "you know that Uncle Wyatt and I getting married means we're all going to be a real family now." "I know," Sarah replied with 8-year-old solemnity. "Uncle Wyatt explained that you'll be like my mama now, except I can still remember my real mama too." "That's right. And there's something else. In a few months you're going to have a baby brother or sister. How do you feel about that?" Sarah's face lit up with genuine delight. "Really? A real baby? Can I help take care of it? Can I teach it to read when it gets bigger?" Eleanor felt a wave of relief at Sarah's enthusiastic response. The child's generous heart had room for love that multiplied rather than divided, understanding instinctively that families grew stronger through addition rather than weaker through competition. As evening settled over Pine Ridge, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, now officially the Callan family school, watching Wyatt secure the building for the night. Tomorrow, classes would resume with a new sense of permanence and community support. Her students would return to desks arranged by a man who'd learned to read alongside his young niece, taught by a woman whose dreams had survived every obstacle. Small-minded people could devise. The ring on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight, a symbol of new beginnings built on the foundation of shared values and mutual respect. She was no longer the isolated widow fighting alone for her students' futures, but part of a partnership that could weather whatever challenges lay ahead. The carved wooden sign reading Callan Moore Community School swayed gently in the spring breeze, its letters painted in elegant script that reflected the permanence and pride the institution had finally achieved. Wyatt had crafted the sign from a single piece of seasoned oak, each letter carefully routed and filled with deep blue paint that would withstand the mountain weather for decades to come. The hyphenated name honored both Eleanor's teaching legacy and their partnership in creating something greater than either could have built alone. Eleanor stood in the school garden, now expanded to include both educational plots where students learned botany and practical growing areas that would help feed the community's children during the school year. Her 6-month-old son, Thomas Wyatt Callan, slept peacefully in the wooden cradle that had been Wyatt's secret project, positioned in the shade where she could watch him while supervising the older students' agricultural lessons. The spring term had brought changes that exceeded everyone's expectations. Enrollment had increased to 31 students as families from neighboring settlements sent their children to Pine Ridge, specifically for the educational opportunities the Callan Moor school provided. Eleanor had hired Miss Catherine Wells, a recent graduate from the Denver Normal School, as an assistant teacher to help manage the larger classes and provide specialized instruction in advanced mathematics and science. Mrs. Callan, the seed. Germination experiment is working perfectly, announced Mary Patterson, now 13, and serving as one of Eleanor's most capable student assistants. We've got 80% sprouting rates in the plots that use the compost mixture, compared to only 50% in the control plots. Eleanor smiled at Mary's enthusiasm for scientific method, remembering the shy girl who'd struggled with basic reading just 2 years earlier. The transformation of individual students remained the most satisfying aspect of teaching, but Eleanor had learned to appreciate the broader impact of education on community development and family stability. Sarah Callan, now 10, and reading at a level that would challenge many adults, had become the unofficial bridge between the school and the broader community. Her confidence and articulate communication helped other families understand the value of advanced education for their own children. When visitors came to evaluate the school's reputation, Sarah served as a living testament to what dedicated teaching could accomplish. "Aunt Eleanor, should I help the younger children with their reading practice now?" Sarah asked, using the title that had evolved naturally as their family relationships deepened. The girl had embraced her role as big sister to baby Thomas and mentor to newer students with characteristic generosity. "Yes, please take the beginning readers to the library corner," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the collection of books that had grown to fill 3 large cases. The library represented one of Eleanor's greatest successes, a lending system that allowed families to borrow books for home reading, extending education beyond school hours and involving parents in their children's learning process. Wyatt appeared in the school doorway, his presence still capable of making Eleanor's heart skip, despite 2 years of marriage. He'd been meeting with a delegation from the Territorial Education Department, discussing the possibility of designating Pine Ridge as a model rural school that could train teachers for other frontier communities. "How did the meeting go?" Eleanor asked, shifting baby Thomas to her shoulder as he began to stir. "They want to feature our school in their annual report," Wyatt replied with quiet pride. "Apparently, our achievement scores and enrollment growth have attracted attention all the way to the territorial capital. They're particularly impressed by our integration of practical and academic learning." The recognition felt deeply satisfying, but Eleanor's greatest joy came from more personal observations. Families that had once been divided by the school controversy now worked together on community projects. Children who might have received minimal education were reading literature, solving complex mathematical problems, and preparing for futures that would take them far beyond Pine Ridge, if they chose. The afternoon brought Eleanor's favorite part of each school day, the time when all students gathered for group reading and discussion. Today's selection was Little Women, the book Sarah had requested 2 years earlier and which had become a beloved tradition for the older students. "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," grumbled Joe, lying on the rug. Eleanor read aloud, her voice carrying to every corner of the classroom where 31 students listened with rapt attention. As she continued reading, Eleanor reflected on how much had changed since that cold December morning when she'd watched the town council board up her schoolhouse. The scared, pregnant widow, who'd felt so alone and powerless, had become the cornerstone of a thriving educational community that served families throughout the region. The carved wooden sign outside proclaimed the school's permanent place in Pine Ridge's future, but Eleanor knew the real monument to their success was invisible, the knowledge, confidence, and possibilities they'd planted in young minds that would flourish for generations to come.